Every place I go, people are talking about homeless encampments, and your name comes up.
Some are magnificent places of mutual aid and collaboration. Feels like a strong community. People really looking out for each other. And there's some places that are hyper-violent, some of which I've seen that have been overtaken by gangs, human trafficking. We are criminalizing people for the failure of systems. Enforcement without any sort of solution is a waste of money and hurts people. I'm getting worked up here. The elected officials who are talking about involuntary treatment are guising it under the banner of compassion. Shelters are full. They're not clean, safe. They lack dignity. There is no alternative for people to go to. They have to sleep outside. I met a guy who's employed living in an encampment. It's almost 90 minutes for him to get to work. But at least where his encampment is, no one bothers him. I believe people have the right to housing. I do not believe people have the right to be homeless in public spaces. Until the housing stuff is situated, people will need to live in public spaces.
Today's episode is brought to you by Pulse for Good. Real change starts with listening. Pulse for Good helps organizations get honest feedback from the people they serve. Visit pulseforgood.com/invisible. Homeless encampments are a problem everyone sees, but very few people understand. In today's episode, we're going to talk about what the public doesn't see, what real solutions look like. This is an episode that is packed full of information that if you're working in the homeless sector, social services sector, a politician, or a concerned citizen, you must watch or listen to this podcast. Here we are again.
Again, Mark, a pleasure. This is our third time getting together and having one of these conversations.
So then it's a tradition.
A trend, really.
A trend? Yeah. Then when does it become a tradition?
Maybe the fourth time.
The fourth time?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to put that in the schedule.
Okay.
Every place I go, people are talking about homeless encampments. And your name comes up in the encampment resolution. As encampments are growing across the United States, we can't deny it anymore. I mean, some people want to. How do we solve this crisis outside of fixing the affordable housing crisis? Because that is the number one, get people inside. You've developed systems and strategies to effectively reduce encampments.
I find that when it comes to encampments, we have to look at the entire system, right? The encampments, they don't exist in isolation. And you're right, Mark, that focusing on affordable housing solutions would be great, but there's so many things that we need to look at in addition to housing. I'll give you some examples just to get started. So no encampment exists without having some relationship to shelter. Now that doesn't mean shelters are bad, right? Obviously there are some horrible shelters out there, and there's some shelters that are amazing at meeting the needs of the people that they serve. Some communities that have encampments, absolutely, I could tell you that the encampment phenomenon at least is there in part because shelters are full. You know, where we are at today having this conversation in San Diego, that's a big part of it. Shelters are full. There is no alternative for people to go to. They have to sleep outside.
Or shelters don't provide dignity.
Well, and that's the second part, which is you could have shelters that are full, but they're not clean, they're not safe, they're not appropriate, they lack dignity. Or there are communities that have encampments that have lots of shelter space. And that's one thing that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. There's an assumption that all encampments are there because shelters are full. Sometimes encampments are there because people have rejected shelter. And instead of our system leaders and our political leaders saying, hey, we need to look at what's happening behind the shelter screen and
something's wrong.
Something's wrong, right? People don't feel it's a safe place. They don't feel dignified, or they don't feel they're treated as human, or you got empty spaces and we got hundreds of people sleeping outside. Instead, we seem to be doubling down on things like it's the fault of the person, not the system. Right. So I definitely think we need to look at shelters. That's part one. Part two, we need to look at where discharge planning is coming from. So if people are leaving corrections, or people are leaving hospital, or people are aging out of the child welfare system, historically, we might have said those are referrals to shelters. But when shelters are full, where are those entities referring to? They're referring to streets and then saying, oh, by the way, follow up on your aftercare from the hospital, or follow all the conditions of your release from incarceration, which really difficult for people to do in those such situations. The third thing I like to look at in the space of encampments is really relative to what's happening in a regional context. If we look at continuum of cares throughout the country, especially large ones that have both urban and rural, or urban, suburban, maybe some rural pieces, is that when the suburban and the rural parts don't have sufficient infrastructure, you end up in more encampments in the urban part, right? Which is people trying to get their needs met. So they may be able to get like their food needs met, food security met, but they couldn't meet their shelter needs. And so they end up in encampments.
Can you give an example of a city?
Again, we're in San Diego. It would be a really good example, right? Where not every one of the municipalities that exist within this county, which is part of this continuum of care, has shelters. Not every single one has a street outreach program. So if I'm a person who's like in part of the county that has no services, I only have so many options within the county to go to get my service needs met. So I might show up here in the city of San Diego, even though I'm not from the city of San Diego, I'm from elsewhere in the county of San Diego. I come here because I know that there's meal programs. I'm not going to starve. But could I get into shelter? Let's say I couldn't. So now I'm in a position where we're looking at me living in a tent in a parking lot in San Diego, or me sleeping rough somewhere in a more remote area of San Diego. And I bring that up in the San Diego context because here in San Diego, they've put a ban on urban camping.
Yeah. I drove around with Michael McDonald the other night, and I've done a bit of storytelling here. We're going around downtown, and there was no tents where there used to be tents, which means they pushed them out to the river or rural areas or by the highways.
And I've been out with outreach teams in this community and have seen some of the far-flung places that people are now surviving. I think in the desire to find a way to survive, which speaks to the integrity of people's like resilience, right? Like this desire to say, against all odds, I'm choosing life over the alternative. But it also speaks to how hard that life is when you get to these far-flung locations. Getting access to any sort of other service, getting access to healthcare. Like I met a guy who's employed living in an encampment, and basically he was explaining to me it's almost 90 minutes for him to get to work from where his encampment is, but at least where his encampment is, no one bothers him. Right. And I just think about like, that's the part of this that people don't see. They see the stretches of tent after tent after tent, and they think that's all what is encampment. But sometimes it is this far-flung tent with people just trying to keep their life together to the best of their ability and are still working or parenting or whatever else they need to do.
You know, I wish I had started this differently.
Okay.
Because I would have asked you, and I think it's fine here in the middle.
Sure.
Paint us the picture of what it's like living in a homeless encampment.
Oh, I wish it was one thing, Mark, but let me tell you some of the variations. And I think the good work you do with Invisible People has highlighted this as well. If you just look at the background of some of the work that you have done over the years. Some are magnificent places of mutual aid and collaboration. Feels like a strong community. People really looking out for each other. People really caring deeply about one another. A lot of sharing of resources. And there's some places that are dens of debauchery, that are hyper-violent, that is about command and control, some of which I've seen that have been overtaken by gangs, some of which have actually been conduits for human trafficking. And while those aren't as plentiful as those that start at least with a purpose of sharing and mutual aid, we've been naive to say that it doesn't exist. And we'd also be doing a disservice, I think, to the work towards ending encampments if we didn't acknowledge that encampments do come with some issues.
Huge.
Like some of the things that you see in encampments. Some have very well managed trash. Some don't.
Right.
Some have access to like portable toilets. Some don't. Some have access to food security that actually comes to the site. Some don't. Some have strong engagement with outsiders. Some don't. Some have leaders that are really looking out for everybody and again are more altruistic in their leadership. Some it's about command and control and it's about power and those sorts of things. There are some encampments I've gone to that have armored guards on the outside of the walkway to get to the actual encampment. And I've been to other places where you show up and it's basically hard to tell. People using the park for playing Frisbee and having a picnic from those who are living in the park and doing things. So it's so different. And I think that's an important question, Mark, because to paint a picture of an encampment isn't to paint one picture. It's to paint several pictures. And even the quality of equipment and tents that people have. Right. Some encampments highly sophisticated in terms of preparation for survival in the elements. Some, I don't know how they're getting through the night. Yeah. Right? It really is quite mixed.
If you run a shelter, a clinic, or a community program, you know how hard it is to get real, honest feedback from the people you serve. Paper surveys get tossed, suggestion boxes are ignored, and the voices that matter most often go unheard. Pulse for Good changes that. Their feedback system includes secure kiosks, wall-mounted units, mobile tablets for outreach workers, toll-free phone numbers, QR codes, and online surveys. so you can reach people right where they're at. Whether it's in a shelter, a clinic, or an encampment, or online, Pulse for Good makes it easy to listen safely, anonymously, and in real time. And with AI-powered sentiment analysis, you don't just get data, you get insight. To learn more, go to pulseforgood.com/invisible. That's pulseforgood.com/invisible.
Right? Some encampments highly sophisticated in terms of preparation for survival and the elements. Some, I don't know how they're getting through the night.
Yeah.
Right? It really is quite mixed.
I love that you're so authentic. You tell the truth.
I try.
One thing before going forward, some of those elements are also in suburbs.
Yes.
Or, you have human trafficking and gangs and drugs and people that are assholes and seeking power. And, so it's not just a homeless encampment thing. But when we're talking about homeless encampment, we need to, as you say, paint different stories.
Yeah. The other aspect of the story that I think we paint is size and scale, right? We often don't think of a single tent in a park as an encampment, but encampment isn't well defined.
Yeah.
Right? So in some jurisdictions, that would totally count as an encampment. I've been to other places that have hundreds of tents, right? Hundreds. And when you get to the place where you have that many people, the scale makes it difficult. It's almost like you're trying to rehouse a village as opposed to rehouse a person. Yeah. It takes on a completely different personality.
One of the things that is always I found interesting is the human dynamic. You get mad at your neighbor, you can't just pitch your tent someplace else.
Correct.
So I have been in tent communities that are constantly in this state of flux because of different personalities, either getting along or not getting along, or even the criminal element, right? There's a huge rural area, and the people over here are really trying to make it, and the people over here are kind of in between, and you don't want to walk up over there because they don't want strangers.
No, they really don't. And that dynamic, I think for sure, Mark, speaks again to the complexity. That there are encampments, and I will say small to medium size in particular, where they can keep a really amazing community focus. But it's almost like they get a tipping point where if you change the composition of personalities or you change the number of people, the entire outward kind of understanding of the encampment changes. To your point about different personalities, someone new moves in and changes it. I've seen that work for awesome purposes. And I've also seen it like, oh my goodness, what happened to this loving community? Because now you have people living there who have completely changed the complexion of that. I've seen everything from, really great people saying, as a collective, we're going to basically come up with a list of tasks that we need to do and divvy out chores, right? Which is not heavy-handed, it's participatory. And I've seen other places where people are like, you do this, or else bad things are going to happen to you. Yeah. In this conversation about encampments, I really feel that enforcement isn't the answer, but I also would be remiss to say that there aren't some things that occur in some encampments, and I want to stress some things, some encampments, that are beyond the level of social acceptance from where I sit.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't have any tolerance for human trafficking. And I don't think if you're in an encampment or not in an encampment, that gives you any reason to do activities such as that. Right. Or the power dynamics that exist with gangs, and most of that gang activity is related to substance use, and most of the substance use is because they've cornered the market in a certain size of an encampment. Gangs, and especially when violence and manipulation is used to extort or exploit people, I don't have a lot of patience for that. But I don't think that when enforcement comes into a place of encampment, they're looking at those dynamics. They're looking more at there's tents in a public space, we need to move people along, not what are the underlying activities that are occurring here that maybe even if we separated them from the rest of the encampment, the rest of the encampment might be fine. And in that space of enforcement, I think far too often we are criminalizing people for the failure of systems, and we're blaming people as their own personal failures, as opposed to saying, like, why is it that the enforcement of bylaws and other laws relative to encampments becomes so problematic? It becomes problematic because it doesn't solve the issue of why people are in the encampment in the first place, right? It didn't make the shelter better, or it didn't make the housing stock more, or it didn't deal with those things. So people have nowhere to go, or it just shuffles people, as I'm sure you've seen, we've talked about many times, people being shuffled from one place to another, didn't solve anything. All they did was lose their ID and get, 5 steps back in the housing process as a result of being swept along. It's traumatizing to have someone with the authority and a gun telling you have to leave. Is traumatizing, and it can further make it difficult for people to trust service providers, right? The next place I go, are you going to rat me out to where I'm at, and then people are going to enforce on me again, right? All those things are massive. And so when I have the opportunity to sit down with enforcement bodies, the first thing I try to look at is the economics. The economics really speak to the fact that I could support someone and house them for approximately a third, in almost every instance, less than half the cost of incarcerating that same person, right? So if this was about sweeping people into criminal justice system for the mere fact that they didn't have a place to live, and usually through acceleration, like I couldn't pay a fine led to some jail time led to other behaviors that might have caused prison sentences, or repeated jail offenses result in prison sentences. But all of these to say is that we have people where it's costing, upwards of $12,000 a month to keep someone incarcerated when we could have housed and support them for less than $5,000. Right? And when I bring that to law enforcement, they say, but that doesn't solve the problem of the calls that I'm getting to get the person out of the park that they need to be there. And that's where I'll say, okay, well, our encampment response isn't just, as you said, more housing that's permanent and affordable, and let's even say supportive as necessary. Part of our solution has to be, what are the interim options? And that's the part that I think I've done a decent job with some communities, is explaining that enforcement without any sort of solution is a waste of money and hurts people. But also, there are interim measures that you can be considering while you concurrently work on the permanent solution. You don't just have to keep people in parks until all the housing is built. We can do different things. And I think the other thing that becomes important in that conversation around interim solutions is to also look at the impact that encampments are having upon the surrounding community, right? So if I have, let's just use open fires, and let's say I have plenty of open fires, and they're potentially
It's a crisis
dangerous.
in every community.
Right?
But you have to stay warm and you have to cook.
This is it. And in the northern climates, it's not to say it doesn't exist in southern climates. I mean,
Life-saving.
when I'm like in Minnesota or North Dakota in the middle of winter, and I'm at a place where people are sleeping outside, they're going to try to stay warm. But I also, if I'm like a neighbor and I'm worried about you lighting my fence on fire, that could be a real concern. Right? Or if I'm worried about a spark is going to set off tents on fire, that's because they're so close to each other, sets off a chain reaction, or we just have an inferno that leads to loss of life of people in encampments and perhaps others, huge cause for concern. But what if we actually took like a barrack-sized tent and it could actually equip it with heating for the entire facility? You could set up your tent inside the barracks tent. You could set up cots inside the barrack tent. You have options. And I'm not saying that's the answer, but it's the sort of thinking that says if the issue is fire, the issue isn't necessarily just kicking everybody out and saying you can't have a fire, because they're going to go 3 blocks over and start a fire to keep warm.
Right.
You've got to come up with an actual interim solution, not just, and yes, it's a Band-Aid, but it helps with the healing process. Right? That's the sort of mentality that we have to get into. I have found that too often, what we're seeing is no appetite to work on the permanent solutions, no appetite to work on the interim solutions, and therefore it is a movement towards things like involuntary treatment.
Now, why do you think that is?
So I think it helps to the narrative politically, right? Who lives in encampments, Mark? It's the people who are mentally ill, the people who use drugs. It is the people who are unwell. So we would be doing society a favor if we didn't have them commissioned into treatment for their addiction and or mental illness, right? That's the narrative that they paint. I'm getting worked up here.
Good. Let it out.
And in that approach to involuntary treatment, the elected officials who are talking about that language are guising it under the banner of compassion. You know what would be a compassionate response? Is if you actually tackled all the NIMBY and backlash at having voluntary programs available at scale. In which case, involuntary would become such a small, still perhaps important, but small part of it, as opposed to our capital P policy solution to deal with dozens, if not hundreds of people as involuntary treatment. And it's the compassionate thing to do. We can't buy this bill of goods. We can't let our elected officials lecture us on solutions that they have developed that do nothing more than exacerbate the problem. But what we're seeing more of, I think, when we're faced with that messaging, Mark, is some of the same lame stuff that you and I think, both just cringe when we hear that it's just about housing. It is about more than housing, or that housing first will solve the encampment.
It's magic.
Housing first is not magic.
It's magic.
It will not solve the encampment. The approach might be really good for helping people once they've left the encampment, but you start from this position where people are using all of this kind of counter narrative response to involuntary treatment that doesn't acknowledge what's the frustration point at the actual beginning is the encampment. Right? You're not solving the encampment. And there are some advocates out there, Mark, and I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I've given up caring about that in our podcast moments. There are going to be some advocates out there who hate me when I say what follows. I believe people have the right to housing. I do not believe people have the right to be homeless in public spaces. I believe until the housing stuff is situated, people will need to live in public spaces. But I don't think anybody has the right to claim public space as private space in the same way that I wouldn't allow a business to go to a park and set up a booth and say we're going to do business out of here every single day without there being some process by which that's determined. When we have people who get to the right to homelessness part of the argument as opposed to right to housing, they're essentially saying people can do whatever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want by the mere nature that they're human.
And it's hurt the cause.
And it's absolutely hurt the cause.
It's crippled the cause.
It erodes public support for what we're doing.
Right.
John Q. Public out there says things like, I have to pay for my housing. Why are all those people getting free housing? Totally flies in it gives, John Q. Public more ammunition.
Yeah.
It also says that we're never going to try to solve this issue, right? It gets back to we are going to manage and do our best, but just get used to it. There will always be people in our parks and our beaches and our other public spaces. I can't believe that that's the society that we want. Yeah. To get to a place where that isn't the reality, though, we're going to need to step up our game, and not just in things like housing, but things like, another unpopular thing.
Boy, you're on a roll.
Some folks who are living in encampments, and the same can be said for some people living in shelters, actually might benefit from institutional care. I'm not saying large-scale state hospitals for people living with psychiatric illnesses in the way that we used to. I'm not talking about that as well. I'm just talking about the people that I meet in encampment who don't have insight and awareness enough to actually take care of their day-to-day needs.
Yeah. We were just with Corporation of Supportive Housing. They have a program in Ohio for people coming out of incarceration into supportive housing, heavy on the support.
Yeah.
Because to qualify for this housing program, they have to have mental illness. And our prisons have become the new insane asylums. People are getting arrested. We interviewed one woman who didn't even get help for her mental illness till after she murdered somebody and was in prison. Where I'm going is, here are people that are coming out of an institution, and I'm sure there's many others that are out on the streets that are not getting help. But it's the support. I mean, they actually help people. The housing is just a piece of it. The support, capital S, is what's huge.
Yeah, and I would say the support piece starts with how we engage people when they're experiencing homelessness to create the trust and rapport necessary to allow us to sustain that support when people move into housing. If we have an encampment response that is just about pushing people along, that capital S support doesn't start. We don't even get to the lowercase support. We essentially have transactional engagements, not transformational engagements. And those transactional engagements are, if I see you, maybe it's socks and water, but we don't have any conversation about housing or your income or your identification or any of those sorts of things, right? It's entirely transactional. If we actually have, though, an encampment response that says we have a dedicated team of people, even if that team is like 2 people, who will be the leads at engaging with this specific encampment, that will allow them to form those trusting relationships, develop some rapport, and then come up with a service plan for every single person. But doing it off the corner of our desk or saying, I want you to respond to this encampment and 7 other encampments isn't going to work, right? The support part isn't going to work. The other thing that's not going to work if we have very kind of superficial engagement with people in encampments is if there is sort of any enforcement response, they're going to think that the street outreach workers were part of the enforcement because they didn't have strong enough relationship to know what the intentions of street outreach were. It ends up being really problematic, and in the space of trying to have co-creation of solutions with people who live in encampments, which is a big part of what I believe, right? I'm not there to tell you in an encampment where you need to go or what you need to do. I'm there to talk about options and figure out what works best for you and to listen to ideas you have as well to co-create solutions. It doesn't let me do that if it's just transactional, right? I have to form relationship.
Yeah. Going back a little bit to where you're talking about the support for forced treatment, I think a big part of it is the paradigms of homeless people or criminal drug addict are so strong and people just want them gone. So they're pushing for forced treatment because they think, oh, there's plenty of treatment and this will get them gone. That is the best solution for me to get that encampment gone. And it's not.
Yeah, it totally is not. And it could cause more harm. It can make it harder the next time to try and serve and support that person. The involuntary treatment part, the part that sounds so good about it to the outsider, is just as you articulated. They assume that the person has had no options, and by the grace of our involuntary nature, we're actually going to get you connected to the thing that you've always wanted and have never got to. And that's how it's put into compassion, as opposed to, screw that. Right? The answer is there was no place when the person wanted detox, or when they went to detox, the detox had so many friggin' rules around how you had to behave in detox, none of which was actually copacetic to where the person was coming from. Or the time between detoxing and getting to residential treatment was too long, or the types of residential treatment that were available have an ideology or an underpinning that they don't agree to or don't aspire to. So for example, newsflash, a lot of treatment centers focus on a higher power. It doesn't work particularly well for people who don't have that same relationship with a higher power, as an example. And for all of the people who are in recovery out there who says, well, you can make anything your higher power, I will say that's not usually how it manifests in the meetings. Involuntary treatment is not about giving people the things that they couldn't get to. It's about masking the fact that we didn't give it to them, and now they're making them thankful that they actually got it.
As a person in recovery,
Talk to me.
I've come to the conclusion there's so many different avenues to sobriety.
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong. Whatever exit ramp that you happen to be on, and that is your fate, whether it's higher power, two dogs, karma, Buddha, just willpower, which rarely works. You know, whatever is that exit that works for you, that's great. We shouldn't be tearing down the other paths because, oh my gosh, you got sober in NA, great. You got sober through harm reduction, great. Whatever.
Yeah.
That's your path.
Yeah. Involuntary treatment is going to take away the autonomy of paths, right? It's going to say our way or the highway.
Well, it doesn't work.
And our way is going to be do it this way. The highway is going to be or forced institutionalized care or incarceration.
As we wind down our time,
Yeah.
service providers listening to this, a politician is listening to this, what are some tangible things, next steps I can do as an encampment response, which I'm going to start using instead of encampment resolution?
Yeah, I think an encampment response starts with the people living in the encampment actually having a voice in moving forward. I think there's a lot of politicians, house neighbors, businesses who assume that people are morons who live in encampments because they've never gone to speak and understand the talents, gifts, and generosity that people have. So talk to resilient people to get resilient answers. That's step number one. Step number two is have an actual plan. The plan has to have some sort of leadership structure. Where does the buck stop with encampments in that community? So if you want to have a response, who's the response leader? Because if you don't name it, lots of different entities will either throw their hands up and say it's not me, or more than one entity at the same time will say it is me, and then they'll have infighting. Third, put in place interim solutions. You've got to have interim solutions. Look at your shelter system. Look at the health of your shelter system. Look at the capacity of your shelter system. Look at whether or not there's people not going to your shelter system. Look at the experiences people are having in the shelter system. Not everybody in an encampment will go to shelter, but better shelter services get better responses for people in encampments. That's number three. Number four, if you don't work on permanent solutions concurrently, you're missing a big part of the encampment response. That if it's going to take us years to build housing, then we better get started now as opposed to waiting another 6 months before we get started.
Yep.
And we better have strong intentionality of who we want to house in the housing. And if we're going to actually do housing for people that have lived in encampments or experienced other longer term homelessness, the capital S support that you talked about before has to be a huge part of that. And it actually has to be based upon evidence-based or evidence-informed models of how we do this. We can't just have touchy-feely teddy bears out there trying to end homelessness. A few other pieces of advice that I'll give just before we close down here. Most communities have to come up with some sort of strategy of dealing with the charitable do-gooders who go to respond to encampments, who are well-intentioned but sometimes make things worse. The non-professional street outreach workers, the church groups, the student groups, the union groups that just decide they're going to go feed people and talk to people. Talk to what's going on in the community before you just show up and start handing things out.
I agree with you. And I have couple of good examples because there's mutual aid groups, which I used to have issues with, but after COVID, there was a lot more food insecurity and people are freezing. My whole thing is service providers don't like the mutual aid groups, and the mutual aid groups don't like service providers. You often hear, oh, we're out here on the holidays and they're taking, and no, that's your choice to go out on the holidays, and people need stuff. I think it should work together. I don't know if you're familiar with Sela in Los Angeles. They're actually doing HMIS. They're coordinating with the service providers. K-Town for All, which is one of my favorites. They're really advocating to get people into housing. They know, yes, hey, okay, I'm giving them a burrito. That burrito is not what the person really needs. We need to get them out of the tent. If I was a foundation,
yes,
I would create some kind of initiative to leverage both, because it's a volunteer army that can do things that the nonprofit can't, and vice versa.
I got some strong feelings about this. Have I seen some good ones? Yes, but I've also seen in one community, swear to God, a group of voluntary do-gooders who were spooning with people in a park because they felt they didn't have enough human contact, and that was the answer to their homelessness.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not kidding. So a sea of people spooning, people experiencing homelessness who come out of their parks.
Oh my God.
Or out of their tents into the park.
Oh,
so
they're the spooners? The spoonies?
The volunteers are the spooner. The people from the tents were the spoonies.
Oh my God.
It was like one big just cuddle fest in the park. I got no patience for that. I got no patience for I know that you have a meal that you feed down there. Our meal is better, so we're going to show up like 10 minutes before you and outmeal you. Like I don't have patience for that.
That's what I mean. But
the coordination, if we are coordinated and if people are part of a system, I don't have a problem with that. If they're just like insurgent in their almost militant approach to addressing homelessness, I don't have patience for that.
Now, the last time we talked about lived experience.
Yes, we did.
And we closed it. You were talking about invisible people and how there was friction because people didn't know my agenda.
Yeah.
I was just so enamored that someone else noticed I didn't speak up about my agenda, and I've been thinking about it. So I was in a shelter that farmed us out as slave labor during the day. I'm not making it up. It was eventually shut down by the FBI. So there was 30 of us in a storefront, Hollywood and Vine Recovery Center. Dr. Gloria Montgomery, she got $750 a month from the county first month, $650 after that. Because of Jesus, they got all kinds of free food. I believe she was probably profiting about $15,000 a month. So every day we would go work in warehouses or wherever she could get money for us. In Hollywood, you could go be an audience, and they paid at the time, it might be more now, $10 a head. So the 30 of us would go to a sitcom or Price is Right. That was fun. Get some candy bars, for a shelter person being out. That was fun. They had us sign a power of attorney, and like my parents would send me $20 cash, and they would take it every week. Any money comes in to anybody, they would take it. Just a horrible place. None of us had a voice. And when I finally was kicked out for the last time, I'd kicked out 3 times, I went into a faith-based shelter, which was doing quote unquote work therapy, which is just a different form of slave labor. It wasn't as bad as Hollywood and Vine Recovery Center. If you spoke up, you were kicked out. And I did not want to be on the streets. And it really affected me. And as I think about it, that was really the start of Invisible People, giving people a voice, because I never had one.
Now that you're visible, how's your life different?
I've never felt closer to a destiny. You also are very unique. The strategies that you come up with in your space are brilliant. You're a leader. And I'm not saying I'm a leader, but because of my background in TV and marketing and having been homeless, this is the closest thing to my destiny. It was on one of the road trips where I was exhausted. I'm driving around the country or Canada interviewing homeless people, and I went, wow. This is your destiny.
Wow.
So it's extremely hard. It's extremely challenging. The homeless sector is stuck on stupid, but we can't give up.
You know, one of the things I love about you and Invisible People, I mean, if you look at the story of the channel on YouTube and that sort of stuff, better than most organizations, you realize that the answer isn't always more resources, it's resourcefulness. So your ability to take your experience of homelessness, your experience in TV, your experience in marketing, and say, I don't have someone writing me a check for $1 million, but I still know how to do this and build it from the ground up. You may not have had $1 million, but you certainly found 1 million followers.
Yeah. One last thing, because
I love our one last things. This
this is an
7.
important last thing. This is a new twist. People don't know that we start discussing what we're going to talk about weeks in advance.
Yeah.
I created an email podcast at invisiblepeople.tv. So people listening, people watching.
Podcast at invisiblepeople.tv, and that's where they can share ideas for what you and I should talk about in future episodes.
That's scary.
Oh, but I love it. And I love that we're doing this on a regular basis, Mark.